For those of you who I have not met personally prior to this, I'm Katie Magoon, and I'm the owner of People Solutions Center. People Solutions Center is an HR consulting firm in the St. Louis area, although we have clients all across the country who are actually folks from a little bit of everywhere are joining us today, and it's great to see you and have you, so thank you. One of the important pieces to know in terms of my background and experience is, first and foremost, I'm as much on this journey as everyone else is. And while I have had the honor and, more importantly, the privilege of having a lot of experience in training diversity and inclusion efforts and getting professional development in this space myself, I truly believe that understanding the language and understanding how to have really productive conversations in this space, that journey never ends. And I hope to just get a little better at it every single day. Knowing that, our goal today is to really talk about how do you as an organization start to lean into this space and really understand how to move forward. With that in mind, I'm going to start today's conversation with a poll. This poll is completely anonymous. Nobody will know who answered or how you answered, but it'll give us a good sense as to where the group is at in terms of having conversations. So our first question on this poll is, on a scale of 1 to 10, how comfortable are you in discussions of diversity and inclusion? And if you'll just take a moment and give me a quick answer to this, I'll share the results so that everyone has the opportunity to see those. But it's a really good sense to give me where the group is at so we can cater our conversations accordingly. I'll give everybody just a few minutes to answer there. Great. Perfect. And I think that's most of our groups. I'll share those results so you have a sense as to, as a group, where we came out, and not unexpectedly, sort of exactly where I thought we might on a search like this, and certainly a webinar type setting. At the end of the day, we've got folks that are very comfortable in this space and feel like they know how to navigate these waters and have probably been very successful at it. I'm guessing that comes with a lot of personal experience and a lot of time spent in your own growth and development and knowing how to address these conversations in a way that's really constructive. We also, on the flip side, most of us are kind of in that mostly comfortable space. Again, I think it's a good starting point. It gets us going in the right direction, but I think one of the things I personally have learned is, even just over the last few weeks, those of us who were mostly comfortable in this space started to even feel a little reflective on whether or not we had gotten it right after all of these years. Prior to starting my consulting business, I worked for Progressive Insurance. And at Progressive, I was their director of recruiting and had the opportunity to do quite a bit of work in the space of diversity and inclusion, including I led their diversity recruiting efforts. I also had the opportunity over a couple of years to go around the company and teach a hidden bias class for all of our interviewing managers across the company. And it gave me a lot of experience in having conversations about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and understanding how to meet people where they were at in their own journey on these discussions. And sometimes, honestly, facilitating workshops that got a little hairy. The reality is, regardless of how much experience you've had, the events over the last couple of months really have made many of us aware that I may be comfortable, but I still have a lot to learn. And I think that's a really important piece to understand as we kind of move through our conversations today. But knowing that folks are in different places to begin with, I think one of the things that we thought was really important today was to make sure that everyone really had a good basis of the language that we're hearing and understanding some of why this all makes a difference to organizations. I think many of us are aware that organizations that are successful in creating the kind of work environments that go beyond just having diversity, but instead creating a sense of belonging for people, are the organizations that are able to leverage the talents of their individuals. There are the organizations where people want to stay. And there's so much benefit to taking teams through the kind of work that it takes to really build those kinds of cultures. And this today is some of the beginning of a lot of that. So when we talk about diversity, what is it we're referring to? And I often tell folks, this is where if you look back at the history of initiatives around diversity and inclusion, you can already start to see the evolution of the language and the conversations that have happened. There's still journeys to go, but with the starting point, we used to just say, we have a diversity initiative. And all the diversity initiative did was get us to think about, let's have people with a lot of differences and bring them into the organization. Because diversity is really about those things that make us different from one another. The iceberg model is often used in the conversation around diversity and inclusion. And the concept behind the iceberg model is, if you look at an iceberg, if we're on the Titanic and we could see an iceberg out at sea, we would know that what we see above the water is a large chunk of ice. But reality is, below that surface level ice is all of the things that actually make an iceberg the most dangerous and the most difficult to maneuver around. And diversity is much the same way. We often think about diversity in terms of the things that we can see and the things that are visible to us. But our diversity also comes from all of these things that are below the iceberg. And organizations that truly have gone beyond just, I'm going to worry about diversity, have figured out ways to make sure that we're not just looking at the criteria that are above the waterline, but that we're also embracing and recognizing and engaging individuals in a way that recognizes and celebrates all that is their diversity, including the things that are below the waterline. And so it's really important. And when we do our workshops, one of the exercises that we actually have folks go through is to look at this iceberg model and think about, what is it they personally feel makes them diverse? Because for many people, we haven't necessarily thought about this. I know in an exercise that I did personally a few weeks ago, I actually struggled a bit with this conversation, even after all of these years of doing diversity and inclusion training, with my mindset sort of shifting to recognize, how much do I really even understand my own diversity? And while I have privilege, no doubt, what else makes me diverse? And have I done enough to understand that impact to me, and therefore how that may be impacting the individuals around me? So understanding this iceberg model is a really good starting point for these conversations. A small group discussion that I love to do with organizations is to break people up and have a conversation around the differences between these key terms. What is a culture of diversity? What does it mean to have a culture of respect, inclusion, and belonging? And on the surface, we think, oh, those are all good things. But in reality, we have to understand the differences between those different types of cultures, because the outcomes are dramatically different, and not all of them are positive. So for example, if I talk about an organization that has a culture of diversity, which at one time in our history of diversity and inclusion efforts, that was the goal. Let's have a diverse organization. I'm going to tell a story about a client a few weeks ago that I was working with, and they had started to bring on some individuals with people of color who had different backgrounds and experiences. And they have done this over the course of about 2 years. And it's the first time that the organization had ever been introduced to really any diversity at all, even if the definition of diversity was just individuals who had ever lived outside of the St. Louis market. And they suddenly started bringing in individuals who had lived different places, had different experiences. They brought some team members on who were people of color, and very much they brought diversity. But they didn't do anything to start the conversations around that diversity. And so what they had was diversity without respect, certainly without inclusion. And they've got a long way to go to get to a culture of belonging. This conversation around belonging is sort of the current evolution of the diversity and inclusion initiatives. And I can share a story I just had happen last week. I was having a conversation with a member of one of my clients' teams, and we were talking actually in the space on diversity and inclusion and some work that we needed to do as an organization around creating what we were referring to originally as an inclusive work environment. And in the conversation with her, I said to her, I said, I really hope we get to the place where you feel you can bring your whole self to work. And more importantly, not that you can bring your whole self to work, but that whole self would be celebrated, and you wouldn't even think twice about it. And it's that piece, when I said to her, you wouldn't think twice about it because you'd really feel like you belong. And her entire facial expression changed. And I'll be quite honest, my own heart stopped beating because I thought, oh, maybe I've just made a mistake. And she paused and she actually got a little choked up as she said to me, Katie, hearing you say those words took weight off of my shoulders. And I was a little taken aback because, to be honest, I was very honest and authentic in what I was telling her. I wasn't expecting it to have such a huge impact. And I said, can you please share with me what did I say that was particularly impactful? And she said, I want to feel like I belong. I don't want to just feel like I'm included. And it really got me thinking, and what a difference in a simple word, but it makes all of the difference. So let's talk a little bit about what is the difference between diversity, inclusion, and belonging, which is really the journey we need to be on as organizations if we want to benefit from all of the things that come with diversity and bringing people together in new and different ways. So if I bring this back to a really simple example from when we were children, because I'm guessing this will relate, regardless of your background and experience, you probably have some story in your history that you remember. So for me, this goes back to a childhood birthday party that I was throwing. I was probably in the 3rd grade because I actually remember that Mrs. Deli was my teacher, and it was time for my birthday party. And my mom had said, we're going to schedule a party for the afternoon, invite the class. And there was one individual in our class that was very nice, but she never really fit in with the rest of the organization, the rest of the class. And in this case, my classmate's name was Irene. And Irene was this quiet girl who I felt like poor Irene cried pretty much every day of our entire grade school career, if I think about it. And she liked to sort of sit in the corner by herself, and she didn't really engage with all of the other students. And so as we're making the list for the party, Mom says, did you invite, is everybody on your class list here? I said, yeah, but Mom, we're going to bring Irene, and Irene's going to cry. And I'm not big on drama, and even as a kid, I didn't really do well around other kids that cried a lot. So it's like, do we really have to bring Irene? My mom made it clear that we needed to include Irene. So we had diversity because Irene was different than all of my other friends, simply based on her approach to life and sort of where she was at. But we never had inclusion because we invited Irene, but then we let Irene sit in the corner by herself and just hope she didn't cry, which really is not what we were going for. And as children looking back, I wish somebody had told me that that wasn't enough. The difference in, even if I go one step further of, okay, now we try to include Irene at the party. So we go over and ask Irene to play kickball because I was kind of a sporty girl when I was a kid, and I loved to play sports. And Irene struggled with sports. That was probably most of the reason that I saw Irene cry every day was we had to go to gym class. So we go over and invite Irene to play kickball. We included her. But the problem was that wasn't something Irene was good at or liked. And so while we tried to include her, she still didn't feel like she belonged. Belonging takes it to the next step. Belonging means finding out enough about Irene to know what Irene actually likes to do, and then doing it with her and learning and growing. And so it's this huge difference between, for years, we've been working on maybe diversity in organizations. Really good groups have been working on diversity and inclusion. And now we have to step back and ask ourselves, has our inclusion work gotten us far enough that people feel like they belong, that people feel celebrated for who they are and the differences they bring and the value that that brings to organizations? And so it's a really clear differentiation in our approach to thinking about how we help organizations really benefit from these types of things. I want to walk you all through an exercise, and we're going to do another poll with this. I'm going to give you about 10 seconds to look at this picture on the screen. And as you're looking at this picture, I want you to count how many things do you see that are pink? take a moment, look at everything you can, and come up with as many items on this particular picture that you can find that are pink. And think about them, make your list on your paper. Everything that's pink, you want to get as much as you possibly can. Now I'm going to ask you a couple of questions, and I want you to just write down the answers to these questions based on what you saw that was pink in this particular picture. So the first question, what was on the floor at the foot of the bed? What two items are on the dresser at the foot of the bed? What is on the floor in front of the window? And what two items are on the bed? Now, I'm going to do a poll based on those 4 questions. What I want you to do for this poll is tell me, how did you actually do in your answers? So let's go through here for just a moment and take a look again at the picture so that everyone can see it. So the first question was, what is on the floor at the foot of the bed? And you can see it's the panda bear in the corner. There's also your correct answer. There seems to be a trunk or a chest at the end of the bed as well. What two items are on the dresser at the foot of the bed? There's a lamp and a photo or a picture frame. What's on the floor in front of the window is that vase with flowers in it. And what are the two items on the bed? There's a couple of answers here that you can go with: computer, phone, there's a blanket, there's a pillow. So the question I want to ask you in the poll is, how many of those answers did you actually get correct? So you've got a couple of options. How did you do on this exercise? You were 4 for 4. That was super easy and you had no problem doing it. I got a few, but I certainly didn't get all. Or my favorite, was I looking at the right picture? Great, wonderful. Thank you all for participating in the poll. Pretty common answers to this particular exercise. I got a few, but I didn't get them all. And when we do this exercise, and especially in settings where we're able to be interactive and we're having conversations, I often get folks that are like, well, I looked at the picture, why didn't I get the questions? And for those of you who said, was I looking at the right picture? You are not alone. That is very common. Usually I can see people's facial expressions where they're looking at me like, I wasn't even in the ballpark. And the reason that that exercise was difficult for folks is because I gave you a filter. I gave you a lens to see the picture through. I told you to look for everything pink, and then I asked you questions about all of the things that weren't pink. I said over and over again, it's pink, it's pink, it's pink. And then I asked you about a black and white panda on the floor. The reality is these are really key pieces to understand some of the concepts behind inclusion and belonging and why we do the things that we do. I'm going to do a second exercise here for you, and I want you to just take a look at the folks on the screen. And in this case, you have the opportunity, you are picking your financial advisor. This is the individual that is going to help you grow your income over years and prepare you for retirement. And you get to pick from these individuals. I'm going to share a poll, and what I want you to do is tell me, based on this information, which of the financial advisors would you pick? Great, perfect, thank you. So here's really interesting. So Susie, far and away, sort of gets the vote in this case. The important part of this exercise isn't even about who you picked, but I want you to stop and think about why you picked them. Because this is the basis of all things that we talk about in terms of unconscious bias. There's no right or wrong answer. If I'm honest with you, I picked these pictures particularly to try to get to different personalities and what will attract folks and what will be different. And the makeup of the group that I have in a session will definitely dictate no one of these people ever wins every time. I will tell you, Paul rarely gets votes, which I always find interesting. I think if I said car salesman, he gets probably a few more votes in that case, but Paul rarely gets votes on this one. The reality is, if you think about what drove your decision, there were probably key pieces that you saw in these individuals that you related to the concept of financial advisors. Susie often wins because she looks the part. She's dressed professionally. She's wearing a suit type of outfit. I have clients who are in the financial advisor space, and they would be the first to tell you, if Susie didn't come to work in her nice suit and her well-groomed outfit, she would have a really hard time winning over clients and making an impression. On the flip side, we have clients who, certainly John, who got some votes. Sometimes folks are like, you know what? I want a financial advisor I can relate with, who's kind of comfortable and laid back and like a little bit more casual because I don't want to feel awkward and uncomfortable. Rochelle, also same concept, that professionalism that Rochelle gives. What's interesting is when I start to change these pictures, even if I change out genders of who is more relaxed and who is more casual in their outfits, answers already start to change. Whether the female is in casual clothes or the female is dressed up makes a significant difference. If I put Rochelle in more casual clothes, Rochelle gets fewer and fewer responses. We have expectations and we don't even realize necessarily what's going into those. So the question is, why does this matter? Why is this exercise important? This all comes down to unconscious bias. In this particular example, I intentionally gave you very limited information about any of the people. So I left you to your own devices to sort of think about what seems to fit in my mind around what a financial advisor should bring. But the reality is our brains do this every day. And before we get concerned that like, oh my gosh, that's horrible, I shouldn't do that. The reality is if our brains didn't do this, we would physically implode. We cannot take in all of the information that is going around us in the world, and our brain can't digest it fast enough. So what it does is it creates filters. Just like in the picture of the pink, where we talked about having pink filters, our brain over time has developed filters to allow it to quickly and react quickly and decide what actions to take and what things to do. Fight or flight is a perfect example of this, where we have to take in information quickly and make snap decisions, and our brain then relates based on past experiences as to how we should react to folks. One of my favorite examples from an unconscious bias training that I did years ago was I used to show this picture of just a ski mask on the screen. And the only thing on the screen was pure white screen with the ski mask with holes for the eyes and for the mouth. And I had to stop using it because I'll be honest, it freaked me out. I couldn't look at the mask without kind of getting the heebie-jeebies. It was interesting because the class that I was teaching happened to be in the southern part of the United States, where it was warm most of the time. But I had one gentleman in the class who had to travel for this particular session, and I knew he was from Minnesota. So I put the slide up and with just the mask in front of it, and I said, tell me the first 3 words that come to your mind. And folks start yelling out words like bank robber, scary, like, going to get mugged, all of these horrible things. And I can see the face of the gentleman sitting in the back of the room, the gentleman from Minnesota, kind of looking around at everybody like, what in the world is your problem? And why are you all going to a scary place? So I said to him, I said, Mike, can you do me a favor? Can you give me some background as to why you have that very strange, like very concerned look on his face? I said, what were the words that came to your mind? He goes, well, it was just cold. I wore one of those yesterday. His experiences changed his filter around even something as simple as a mask. And I think that's really important to know, that when you understand unconscious biases, you start to get that these things make a difference in the decisions. One of my favorite statistics around unconscious biases is that we make 11 judgments in the first 7 seconds that we meet someone. And when you think about the power of that, 11 judgments, and I haven't even known you for 7 seconds. 7 seconds gives you probably enough time to shake someone's hand, maybe to look them up and down and notice the clothing that they're wearing. Perhaps you get the opportunity to say hello and our favorite question, how's the weather? And yet we've made 11 judgments about people. I've had people, in exercises that we do in some of our classes, we will have people guess, what kind of car do you think I drive? What kind of house do you think I live in? And just from 7 seconds of seeing me, people have already started to build their own knowledge. Now, those are all really lighthearted examples, but if you think about this in particular as it relates to your interviewing, it is powerful. Because when you meet a candidate, first of all, you've probably made a good 7 to 10 judgments just on their resume alone. In addition to that, now you meet somebody, and in those 7 seconds, 11 new judgments. What's particularly interesting is the human psyche, most of those judgments are negative. We tend to look for the things that are negative, and most of our biases tend to be negative biases. It's just how our brains are built. So the question becomes, what do we do about it? And how do we move forward? Continue to say, understanding the language of diversity, equity, and inclusion is how we start to get better and reduce the impact of these unconscious biases. Even if we didn't intend for them to be there, we need to start to learn what they are for us individually and find ways to question those biases, give yourself experiences to ensure that your filter isn't always pink, because your pink filter may be leaving out important pieces of information. One of the key dialogues that we've heard even more recently in the last few weeks is this concept of privilege. And I will be honest, the more I talk about it, if we thought the concept of biases made folks kind of stand on end and feel defensive, this conversation of privilege is even more challenging. And the reactions from individuals are probably far more aggressive than we've ever had. And yet many people, up until probably a month and a half ago, many people had not heard the term privilege, and certainly the terminology of white privilege was not something that you heard on a regular basis just by turning on the news. It's actually really valuable and important that we're starting to have these conversations, and it's really important that we help people work through this, because as people just put up the wall and get defensive, it will keep us as organizations from moving forward in the conversations that we need to have. But understanding privilege is really important. I'm going to share an example from my own experience. This one in particular, though, I want to say up front, this is a really mild example. This is not about, this is not your powerful, gee, I've had privileged moments in my lifetime thing. And I'm doing it intentionally because it's kind of a lighthearted example that for those of us who haven't necessarily been exposed to this conversation before, gives you the opportunity to put it into a context that maybe is a little easier to take, which then helps you understand the concept, which then helps you lean in to do more self-reflection and introspection. So here's my example. My friend Brian and I have been running partners for years. We don't live close together. We live, across town from each other. So we run on our own during the week, and then we meet up for long runs on the weekends. And a couple of times, Brian and I have trained together for longer races. We've both done some marathons, and we certainly do halves on a regular basis. So we'll meet up on a Saturday or Sunday for, an 8 or 9 mile run. And a couple of years ago, we were doing some training along those lines for a spring event. And it was early spring, which is a little bit tougher for me because in the wintertime, I have a hard time getting out early enough in the morning to get in a run. And so Brian and I are on this long run on one Saturday, and I'm struggling. I'm just not having any, I'm needing to walk more, I'm tired, and quite honestly wasn't really even enjoying myself like I normally do. And Brian kind of looks at me and says, what's going on? Are you running during the week? Have you been training? What's wrong with you? And which was his nice way of saying, are you being lazy? And I said to Brian, I said, I'm really having a hard time getting my runs in during the week. And so my long run on the weekend, I feel like I'm not prepared. And Brian kind of looked at me like, well, you always get up at 5. That's when you get up at run and you do that. I said, I know, but in the wintertime, that's hard for me. He's like, well, 5 o'clock is 5 o'clock, Katie. This doesn't make any sense. I said, but I can get up at 5 in the wintertime and I can't run. I can't run in time to go to work because it's not light out in the wintertime. And I can't run by myself through my neighborhood, no matter where I lived, because I've lived all sorts of places. I won't run by myself in the dark. Brian kind of looked at me like I had 3 heads. And he's like, well, why not? And I thought that was a really odd question. Why would a single white female not run through any neighborhood when it was dark outside? Because it's scary. And it was one of those moments that Brian and I, who've had a lot of conversations about privilege, but not usually in context to he and I from a male-female perspective, but more recognizing our own white privilege and how that might impact others in a negative way, all of a sudden looked at each other and said, wow, we actually have a privilege moment here even between the two of us. And that's what's really interesting to get to, because the word privilege for most folks makes us go like, did that person just tell me I did something wrong? And very clearly, Brian didn't do anything wrong. Brian could go run in the dark along his street and not have a problem. But I, as a female, could not and not feel safe. And if I take that one step further, there's some really good, there's some great podcasts that I've heard folks share, but certainly I've even seen it in my own neighborhood, and we've seen it recently in the news of there are folks that because of their color cannot safely run in a neighborhood because somebody might think they don't belong there. That by definition means that there is a privilege that exists. Brian didn't ask to have that advantage, he just has it. He wasn't misusing it. He wasn't beating anyone else down because he was ahead of them. He just had it. And that's an important piece to understand when we talk about privilege. It does not mean that the person took advantage of their head start in some way to intentionally harm someone else. It doesn't even mean they did something to get the privilege, just by being who they are. So if we take that one step further, and talk about the term white privilege, essentially what it says, and there are really great podcasts, I'm gonna give you some resources on at the end. White privilege is not saying that you have somehow done something wrong to create the situation. But what it does mean, and it also does not mean that you don't also have challenges in your life, right? I have challenges in my life. It doesn't necessarily, like that doesn't mean I don't have privilege. The difference is that every day when you wake up, those challenges that you have are not because of the color of your skin. And there's a really powerful YouTube video that I've got a link to at the end of this, where a coach lines up a group of students along kind of the end zone of a football field. And he says they're gonna run a race to the end of the football field. And all these students are lined up there, and there's individuals with all sorts of backgrounds and experience and people of color, and you name it, there's diversity all along this line. But he starts to read out a list of questions, and for every question you could say yes to, you get to take 2 steps forward. And the questions are things that individuals who, you know, if you are a white person, they probably are things that have related to your life. That individuals of color may not have had those same experiences or may not have had those same advantages. So easy things like, has anyone ever said, where are you really from? That's never happened to me. Nobody asked me that question, but it will happen to you, particularly if you're an individual of an Asian background. It's one of those things that happens regularly. So, as these 2 steps happen, all of a sudden you look back and there's a group of people that have to start the race in the end zone, while some of the players, some of the runners are at midfield. And so they have an advantage for right or for wrong. They didn't ask for it, it happened. That is what we're talking about when we're talking about privilege. Our job in diversity, equity, and inclusion is about first of all, recognizing that that privilege exists, getting comfortable in understanding the impact that it has, and then finding ways to make sure that we create equitable environments that allow individuals to catch up and that allow individuals to have as fair of a shot as they possibly can. And that's the key piece of what we're trying to learn here. Another example I have from my own personal experience of privilege actually comes from a situation that I had with another friend of mine who is a member of the LGBTQ community. And he and I were walking with a group of friends down the street one day in our neighborhood, which is actually an extremely LGBTQ friendly community here in the St. Louis area. And my husband and I were walking down the street in front of he and his partner. And we were walking along, without even thinking about it, we'd been holding hands. My husband said something and then leaned over and gave me a kiss. I didn't think a lot about it. It wasn't some big public display of affection. He just gave me a kiss and we kept walking. And my friend Randy, who we've been friends for 25 years now, says to me, wow, it would be really nice to be able to do that. And I stopped and I kind of looked at him like, what are you talking about? He said, it would be great if Craig and I could walk down the street and hold hands and he could just give me a kiss. And I was like, well, that's dumb. Then do that. Like, I can't help if you guys don't want to, like, you don't want to hold hands. And he said, Katie, never in a million years, even in a friendly LGBT community neighborhood, would I feel comfortable doing that. It was a learning moment for me because I had to ask a really crazy question. Why not? Because of my privilege, it had never dawned on me that someone would not feel comfortable doing that. But it's that learning moment where you stop to say, please share with me, why not? This is where listen to learn comes into play. Because what I did, as opposed to tell him he was wrong, or tell him he was crazy, or more importantly, try to come back with an example from my own life of when I ever felt that way, was I just stopped and said, please share with me. And I listened. And more importantly, for once in my life, I listened to learn. And that's really the key to what we need to get organizations to do at this point, is to stop telling each other how we should feel and start instead figuring out what other people are telling us. Microaggressions are another really important part of this, and I want to make sure we have time to talk about it because this is another new term that many folks, if you have not spent much time on your key learning in this space, microaggressions is likely A, a new term for you, and B, a little scary. Because aggression in and of itself indicates that you did this to me intentionally. And so I have folks who are freezing and they're like, oh God, what have I done? And how did I offend? And I didn't mean to, and you took it the wrong way. And all of these really, really hard emotional reactions. I had a client, one of the clients I talked about earlier, as we were talking to their employees about where we were at in this conversation of diversity and inclusion. One of their employees on a focus group said, there are microaggressions happening here every day. My phone after that focus group went like high alert red. I had employees from every single, like I think at least half of the people on the focus group called me after that and said, how could she say that? She said we were racist. And I'm like, no, she didn't. She said there were microaggressions. That's not calling you racist. That's talking about what's happening. We seem to have equated this concept of microaggressions, and usually because we just didn't know the term, people are thinking that you're saying you're being racist, and that makes it intentional. The reality of microaggressions is that they may be intentional, but oftentimes they are unintentional, and they're based on our lack of understanding, and more importantly, some of it is coming from our unconscious biases. And this is where all of these pieces come together. I'll give you a perfect example. I worked with a client over the last couple of years, and there's sort of two individuals in charge of the organization, two highest ranking individuals, and one of them is a woman of color. And I was talking to the board. There had been some issues around leadership styles and so forth. And I was talking to a board member who said to me, Katie, I'm worried about how she's leading the team and what's happening and all of these things. And she said, and I said, well, tell me a little bit about her leadership style. Tell me what I need to know. And she said, well, she's always worried about microaggressions. And I think she's making it a thing, and shouldn't be a thing. And I was like, oh, we're probably going down a tougher road here. We're going to have to hang on a little tight and figure out how to have the conversation. And she said, because I'm not racist. And I said, okay, tell me more. Tell me about your implication, your experience with her, and more importantly, how do you see her as a leader? And she led with, well, she's really articulate and she's really smart. And I thought for a moment, and there's are the microaggressions that she's been referencing when she tells me that they're happening. Because the reality is, when folks describe me to someone, they don't lead with, I'm articulate. When they describe a white male, how many times have you ever left a meeting and thought, oh, I'll describe the speaker who happened to be a white male, and I'm gonna say he's articulate, because we assume that they would be articulate. And so the bias of the thought of the surprise that a person of color is articulate then puts it at the top of the adjectives that we use to describe them. And those are microaggressions. So there's some examples here on the screen that really kind of give you some ideas around the microaggressions that individuals run into on a regular basis. And they're important to know and understand, but more importantly, it's important for us to be introspective and respectful of understanding the things that we say that unintentionally let our bias show and show that we've painted a picture of what we think individuals are supposed to be. Microaggressions are even more, while we've talked about diversity being what's above the waterline and below the waterline, microaggressions even more so than other forms of things that we say from an inclusion perspective seem to be showing up more frequently, and particularly around things related to race, because they are based on those filters that are coming to us based on the color of people's skin. And when we talk about how do you overcome microaggressions, folks are like, well, how do I change it? If it's unintentional, how do I know when I'm doing it? And I think this is a really important piece is, first of all, don't go around and start asking people of color, is that a microaggression? Is that a microaggression? Did I say that? Like, it's not about asking individuals to speak on behalf of their entire race, but more importantly, learning and understanding your own, how are you painting pictures because of the filters in your head. It's about exposing to yourself to individuals that have experiences and backgrounds that are different than your own. It's also about learning to grow and spending some time understanding this space. And so it takes some work. It's not easy work. It takes some willingness to be a little vulnerable in this space. But most importantly, it's about making sure that we're saying that we're learning what these microaggressions are that are unintentional, so we can stop doing them and we can stop saying them and we can stop making people feel the way they do. So a couple of ideas in terms of how do you work on your own personal reflection and growth. Because at the end of the day, whether you're a leader in the organization, you're the owner of the company, or you're the HR practitioner in an organization, we have to be the ones leading the charge in the organization to say, this is important. And more so than any other topic that you as a leader need to lead by example, diversity, equity, inclusion, and the ability and willingness to start your own journey of understanding in a space is going to be the thing that moves the needle. You can't just throw a party or give a holiday because the news told you you should. You've got to understand why you're doing the things you're doing, and you've got to be willing to look inside. We will make mistakes. I guarantee. I've been doing this kind of work for a really long time, and I make mistakes all the time. One of the resources I have here on the next screen is a book that I've seen and a podcast that I watched that where she talks about why conversations of race are so difficult for people. And the reality is, as a white person, I am terrified that I will say something wrong. And what she said in her podcast was, and very nicely, she sort of said, you know what, get over yourself, because you are worried you might say something wrong. And she said, but as a person of color in a conversation of race, I'm worried that you'll say something that hurts me. And that's powerful. So we want to make sure we teach people how to have conversations about diversity, equity, inclusion, that it's okay to be wrong, but how do we get to the point that we're not hurtful? And how do we learn without hurting others? And a big piece of that comes with self-reflection. So there's a couple of online assessments, and I'm going to give you a way to get these materials from us after the webinar so that you can click on the links and find the information that you need. There is one, the first assessment is on unconscious bias, and they're really kind of fun assessments you can go through that give you a sense of what are your own filters, particularly around race and gender. What are the biases that you have? Because we can't unpack them and do something about them until we know we have them. And by definition, unconscious biases, we don't necessarily know we have. The other tool that I have found extremely helpful is an intercultural development index. And there's a woman here in St. Louis, her name is Amy Narishkin. She does amazing work. If you are an organization that is ready for a deep dive, heavy lifting, diversity and inclusion, this is not, for most companies, this is not your good, like, this is not your starting point. This is, we've done some, we're ready for deeper dive. Amy's company, Empowering Partners, does really phenomenal work in this space. And in fact, she's, even if just on an individual basis, you're looking for some growth, she is offering a workshop over the next couple of weeks that is amazing. She's done a lot of work in the space at the community and the teaching level as well. So I've included her website here, but she also does work on this intercultural development index, which gives you, you go through, you take an assessment. There's no right or wrong answers. You're just, answering questions based on how you feel or how you see. And it tells you sort of where you are in your own journey of understanding diversity and inclusion. And more importantly, how do you help sort of move that needle in terms of leaning into this space? So great work there from Amy. The other piece I always recommend to folks, if this is a space that you're trying to get more comfortable in, expand your network and your experiences. Go meet people that haven't had those same experiences that you have. Find ways and then listen. The most important thing we can do is stop telling people who we are and how we feel, but more importantly, when we see things happen, we say something, we correct, and when we've made mistakes, we ask the question. So tell me more, tell me why. And listen to learn is important because, again, don't listen with, but let me tell you why you misperceived that, or let me tell you why I had an experience that was similar. But just listen, because for many people, that's not the experience that they've had in conversations of race. And when you're able to do that, it changes their approach to the conversation, and more importantly, we actually learn something. So from an organizational perspective, how do we create a culture of belonging? So how do we take not just let's include you, but let's celebrate you? And if you think about the last time you hung out with your friends on a weekend, or your family, whoever it happens to be, that group of people where you truly feel you belong. And ask yourself, what's different? What is it about, like, why is that feeling of belonging so important? And one of the key things that you'll start to realize is when you feel like you belong, you don't just bring your voice to the table. And maybe you would even have a voice at the table and kind of be heard. But when you belong, you don't think about how you're going to approach it. So when I'm sitting around a table with my friends and I know I belong, I just say what I'm thinking. I talk and I listen differently because I'm not worried about whether or not they're judging how I said it or how I'm sitting or what I look like. I just get to be. And that's the kind of environment we want to create from a work perspective. Is how do people bring their whole self to work and then be comfortable that that whole self will be celebrated and encouraged. So they don't have to be thinking about whether or not folks are judging them based on the color of their skin or their religious belief or the fact that they're, a female in an all-male group. These are the kinds of things that matter. So how do we get there? First of all, workshops matter. Interactive conversations, even the exercises that we did today kind of through polling, you do those and then you have conversations. But we have to make these safe spaces for folks because we have to recognize that first and foremost, we don't all come to the table at the same starting point of this journey and this comfort level. And so bringing people together with workshops that start to open this door, start to give people the right language and the right understanding, and then lean in and teach people how to lean in and listen to learn from each other. There's 2 different trainings that we've personally have done a lot of in this space over the years. One is our unconscious bias training. And I will tell you, if you have folks interviewing, this is where you need to start. It is a great opportunity to get different outcomes from your interviews and really make sure you are hiring the most qualified person based on their actual qualifications and experiences, not based on the filters of pink that we put in front of folks, not just race, but all of those filters. So it's a great session for interviewing folks. And then the next one is creating a culture of belonging. This really takes it from just how do we not have sexual harassment and how do we not have discrimination, which is important. We never want to leave those things out, but it's a really low bar. So instead, how do we create, and in addition to, how do we create a culture where people feel that they belong? Focus groups and team surveys are a great way to get a sense of where your team is today. Questions like, when you come to, do you feel you are celebrated for the diversity that you bring to the organization? Do you feel like your voice is heard at the table? Engaging employees and finding ways to celebrate and promote diversity and inclusion, and even organizations that haven't traditionally done this, start to lean in. This does not mean celebrate Cinco de Mayo and things that aren't real holidays, but get folks to do research. If you have a large enough organization, and it doesn't even need to be a huge organization, but have people start to think about employee resource groups and leveraging the differences that folks have to share with others and give them space to do that so we learn to grow. Keep in mind that if you're using employee resource groups, which are phenomenal, and if you haven't started them yet, but you're thinking you may want to, keep in mind you've got to start by promoting the concept that you don't just join the ERGs that you belong to. Like, I don't just join the women's ERG, but more importantly, go join the employee resource groups that I don't belong to, because that's where the learning will happen. That's where the growth will happen. I had the experience at Progressive of starting the military recruiting employee resource group. It was just the employee resource group for all folks military. You wouldn't believe the number of times that when I share that with people, they say to me, I shared it for 3 years. It was a great experience and I learned so much. And they're like, oh, thank you for your service. I'm like, I haven't served in the military. Oh, but you started an ERG, but you aren't military. That's the whole point of the ERG is I started the group and I got it going because it was a space that I wanted to learn in. And it was a space that meant something to me, but I also knew I didn't have the experiences there to really relate. And I had a team of individuals that had several people with military backgrounds that I didn't feel like I had enough knowledge to be able to relate, understand, and make a difference. Likewise, I do not have children. I joined the parenting employee resource group because I need to know more. I'm not a person of color. That's pretty obvious by the video screen. So go join the African American employee resource group so that I can listen to learn. And that's the way that we can work with this on teams. Policies and process to address concerns. You definitely need to take a look at your policies and processes across the board from an HR perspective and make sure that you have a meaningful way to, first and foremost, make sure you're hitting that minimum bar from an HR perspective. Then start to look at it and say, are there messages in our policies that perhaps don't result in equity in our organization, and do we need to think about that from that perspective? And that's an important piece to do in your policy review. I have included some resources here that I have found to be particularly helpful in my own journey, which will always continue. Privilege, the Race of Life, that's the story I referenced with the coach and the football field race. It's a great short YouTube video, but really powerful if you're still looking for information to understand privilege. So you want to talk about race. This is the link to the podcast. It's actually also a book that gives a really good insight as to how to have this conversation about race and some of the common mistakes that we make in leaning in and starting those discussions. And so even just the YouTube video alone gave some really good insight on the mistakes that we sometimes make and how to make that an easier conversation going forward. And then if you have not taken the opportunity to read Waking Up White and Finding Myself in a Story of Race, it is an absolute must in the beginning of this journey. It is a book that is, first of all, very eye-opening and will help make you think, but it's also written at the end of each chapter are questions that basically book club type questions that first and foremost you can do as self-reflection exercises that just help you start to think about things on your own. And then also do work well if you're trying to put together a group of individuals that want to have conversations in this space. If folks are interested, if I've got a few folks who have interest in a ongoing book club on Waking Up White and Finding Myself in a Story of Race, if you email us to get the presentation materials, and then also tell me that you might be interested in that book club. I am actually, I've read the book and been through it, but I would love to put together a group of folks who have a common interest in sort of doing some of these self-reflection exercises together as well. So please note that in any email that you might send us. We have a few minutes here as we wrap up. If there are any questions, feel free to put those in the chat as we go along, or even just take your video off for a minute and wave your hand at me. I would love to answer those. I do want to, as I'm waiting for folks to have a minute to type their questions into the chat, I do want to let you know that, again, because we really do appreciate you leaning in and taking time to attend the session today, any individual who is interested in a free 1-hour diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy session with us, this is essentially an opportunity. I get on the phone with you, we talk about where your organization is today in terms of DE&I, and then talk about sort of what are the next steps for your organization, whether that be, thinking about what training are you doing with interviewers, or how do companies get started with employee resource groups. Again, I've done this with both large companies. Progressive Insurance was an amazing experience in terms of DE&I, but in addition to do that with smaller organizations where I've had the chance to figure out how do you do this even when you don't have a huge budget to do it with. So if you will text your information, if you put in HR info to the number here on the screen, and it'll ask you for your email address, and then that will give us everything we need. We'll reach out, but we'll know specifically that you're looking for the special offer on the strategy session. And then the last piece is our contact information. If you are looking for a copy of these presentation materials, I'm always happy to share, especially since they have resources in them that I find really valuable, and some links that are useful for you. If you'll email us at hr@peoplesolutioncenter.com, we'll get these materials out to you. And certainly if you are interested in participating in kind of an ongoing conversation around the book Waking Up White and Finding Myself in a Story of Race, we would be very happy to have that, get a group of folks kind of ready for that. So thank you again for taking time for this conversation. We will send out a survey as a follow-up. Please answer it so that we can continue to hone this and make sure that we're hitting the right messages for folks. But we really, really appreciate your time, and we hope you learned something as we went through this conversation today. Take some time this weekend for self-growth, self-reflection, and think about how this can make an impact on your organization. Have a fantastic day, everyone.